sitting next to my phone.
It didn't burn up everything, but it did. What did it do? It got his attention, so it was a beacon. God also served as a beacon elsewhere to the Hebrews when they're wandering through the desert as a pillar of flame. There was fire that occurred in the Old Testament, and it came. But was God in the fire? Do you remember that story? The elements that were there, the earth, wind, and fire, that came, were things that were powerful and destructive. But was God in any of those things? No. So God's fire is different than the fires we know in our world. There was another fire that's not in our gospel, but in our gospels, but still has no less bearing on the world of the church. Some of you might remember that Rome had a huge fire during the reign of Nero, and who was blamed for it? Nero or Christians, depending on who you ask, playing your violin, and stuff like that. There were also Christians that were Jews, and Jews were also blamed because these upstarts in the empire were part of the group that was being castigated. Rome needed a place to turn its view when the fire was raging and to instead hold that fire and project it onto other people. Different kind of fire. The kind of fire they burned the temple with. The kind of fire that came all around people and to destroy. When we consider the later part of the Christian church, we think of developments there. Fire was used too. Thinking they were going to bring the fire of the gospel to the Holy Land, the Crusaders instead brought sword and plunder and destroying fire, burning crops and towns and bringing total disarray and removal of people and basking in it as if it was the glory of God. Does that sound like the light of God to you? And later, when those who would stand up against the church for the ways that it was not showing the light but keeping people in the dark, they burned them in many different forms, so fire to be all-consuming. The very same church that baked its bread in the fiery ovens also used it to destroy. So this fire is different. In the fires of creation, we think of one thing. We don't think of fire, right? We don't think of that transformation till later. What do we think of instead? Anybody remember? What does the Spirit of God do over the waters? Thank you. I had to think about that one for a while. What is the opposite of fire? Water. But water, too, can be affected by a wind. It can become very torrential and everything like that. And this is the thought, that fire in its uses can be helpful when it is contained, when it is mitigated, when in some ways it is regulated. You think of old coal burners going out and lighting underneath a mound of earth and just having to watch it for 48 hours, staying awake that long, just to make sure that the fire didn't go up in smoke and go out to the rest of the forest around them. The idea that fire could be used in a way to heat homes, to provide cooking. So too is the fire within. Often enough, we think of God's fire coming to us, and then there's this power that happens in bringing it forward. That the power of God is meted out almost as a wrathful anger sometimes, an unquenchable passion that we have. But we do know, because we call them crimes of passion, the idea that passion can be unregulated. So passion and fire need some help too. That fire instilled in us at baptism, instilled in us, and we even showcase by the candle that is lit here, showing us the way, the truth, and the light. If any of you remember Fahrenheit 451, do you remember the book? What's the temperature at which paper burns? 451 Fahrenheit. Keep that in mind, not Celsius. Fahrenheit. That book indicates for Guy Montag a couple of things. Sorry, I feel like getting away from it today. I'm passionate, I'm rised up, I've got fire in the belly. The thing is that when they come to a house in the first few pages, what do the firemen do? Do they put out the fire? What do? They start it. What are they burning? Books. And people. And houses. The woman who stays in her house at the very beginning of the book, bewildered, leaves Guy questioning everything he's learned. Why would she sacrifice herself for all these books in a fast-paced society that if you just keep your head straight on, that all you have to do in fast driving and all the entertainment you could want, why on earth would anybody die for books? But we see another use of fire later in the book. Do you remember? What is it used to do then? When they gather around a campfire, it warms the people running from the book burners. And it lights the books that they read so that they can actually see the words on the page. Fire contained and proving that it can be used for life and not death, not destruction. When we think about how our passions sort of overwhelm us, we have to sort of come back to this idea that God puts a fire within us to care. And there is nothing wrong about caring in this world, but it does spill over when our cares start to make us not care about the other person in front of us. When our cares overwhelm and consume ourselves, the passion that we have that God may have given gets distorted and turned into something that is used sometimes in anger for something, and anger is natural, but anger in its place. Because there is righteous anger, but how many times do we do that in a lifetime? A few. A few is good. The thing is that when we are consumed with passion for the Holy Spirit, sometimes we may think that we have the whole of it down to ourselves. When we are looking so much for comfort in this world by the warmness of a fire, we may forget that others don't have that same comfort in the warmth that God may give us, or that we believe is just for us. Sometimes the fire that is within us spills over into wrath. And we get this unquenchable fire that everyone should think and be on fire in the same way that I am on fire. But we understand, first and foremost, that this fire that we have is not ours to give away, but ours to maintain, to regulate. In northern England, there was the idea that for generations, fire would not be started or would not be stopped. It would be continually fed, because without that fire, you have to start it all over again. In a very wet climate, doesn't work so well. For generations, people feeding the fire over and over again just to keep people together. In Anglo-Saxon England, people would sit around the fire and discuss things, and you'd use, for the longest time in history, the only source of light in the home, not candles, too expensive, the fire that you're sitting in front of before bed, maybe just a few embers to do the needlework that couldn't be done earlier in the day. And then, of course, the fire had another use. Not just to light, not just to warm, but to feed people. People for generations sat around and put the food right in the fire sometimes. They needed it to cook, but every single use of this reveals that it's the fire that brought a community life and continued on with life, not to destroy, not to uptake anything, although we read stories of that throughout history. It's a sense that the fire that is within us is only as strong as it is the community that comes around it. It is true that God puts a light in each of us. A little of God's light is in each of you. A little of that flame and passion for justice, to make things right in this world. That little bit of Jesus that says something's not right here is within us. And the thing, though, is a candle on its own can be lit, but in a windstorm, does it fare very well? No. But when you put a bunch of flames together, you get something that doesn't go out as easy. When we come to thinking about how God implants in us this little bit of justice, we do turn to the very fact today that we look at in our Acts passage. That God doesn't speak just one language to everybody, God speaks all the languages. Which reminds us of another story that we've heard. One in which there was destruction, and it was, we are told, God's fault, or God's doing. The people at the Tower of Babel wanted to build a tower into the sky. And they were collaborating. This is good. Maybe that helping in creation that was put in there is a good thing. But they were doing so in order to challenge the very God and not needing God in order to ascend to the heavens themselves. So God strikes their plan with some division and gives languages to all the peoples of the earth to confuse them, to make it so this project kind of didn't go the same way. And God does speak every language, though, because when we get to the gospel, we hear again that God is for the nations, not just for some. So when we come to this Acts passage, we may want to think that there is one language that is being spoken, but in each language of each person that is there, God speaks to them. So it is with us. How many of us have misunderstandings and miscommunications and things that come between us so that we do not necessarily collaborate as best we can? That the fires within us don't ignite each other, instead they just ignite in between and burn everything in between. This is Mental Health Awareness Month. Did you know that? Anybody know that? Okay. A couple people. Mental illness is a distortion. In many ways, we live in a world that it has a regular sort of life and has people that are dealing with suffering. But the particular distortions that come with mental illness come with fear. Fear of self, fear of others, fear of a world. Normal, usual fears. It's just a bit of an overreaction in the body. How many of you know someone that is dealing with mental illness, or that you yourselves, know that you have mental illness? Yeah? Almost the whole room. The thing is that this passion that consumes us becomes anger towards self and others is often found in the fact that it is distortion of the reality of the trust and the collaboration that we have. We often think sometimes of the God that goes over the waters and then makes things not good somehow in the sense that sin is in the world. But sin is part of our world in a sense that it not only serves as a distortion, but as a reminder that God has to work in each of us. That the fire that God lights on earth within each of us and within our communities gathers us to be lights, to be able to see and discern that light, to be able to warm and to comfort others, to be able to care and ignite other people by this water and by the soothing of souls and consciences. Mental illness often feels like fire. People say that. They say there's a burning that happens all around in the chest or in the arms or sometimes in the stomach. There's sometimes a burning that people say is associated with that, just a sensation. Sort of an impediment that can't get you beyond it. But the fact of the matter is that it is just the body's response in fight or flight. And the thing is that when it does that, there are ways to mitigate it. There are tools that God gives us in each other of soothing. And the first and foremost one, many of you know this with suicide, is what? Is it a medicine? Is it a doctor's visit? What's the first thing you can do? Phone call. Or? Believe what they say. How interesting. That the very same principle that helps mitigate mental illness is the same thing that we all deal with in community. Because we need each other to be able for the fire to be there. We need each other in order that we are not alone, because honestly, that isolation happens whether you have mental health illness or not. Because we all live under that distortion of sin. Because the first thing that we have to remember is that when God created this world and flowed as a spirit, as a wind, it was not in destruction. It was not come to condemn the world, but come to give it life and to instill the fire of God in it. Amen.